Welcome back to the class video for Module 3, the second of two modules devoted to Locke's second treatise of government. In the first part of this module, we looked at chapters 7, 8, and 9 and Locke's description of the social contract and the origins of political or civil society. Here in the second part of the module, we're going to look at chapters 17, 18, and 19 and Locke's theory of the right of revolution. Certainly this is the part of Locke's text that is most radical, one wants to say most revolutionary in its historical context, 17th century Europe. One would be hard-pressed to find anything comparable to the doctrines described in the final part of the second treatise anywhere preceding in the Western canon of political philosophy. Certainly historians and philosophers are well aware that the people do rise up, that people do rebel against their governments and change the forms of government. But the articulation of a doctrine that the people have a natural right to do so, that is, to create an ideology of government that is premised on the right of people to resist the rules of government, is not only paradoxical, but as you saw in the reading, perceived as anarchic in the context of 17th and 18th century political thought. So this is the most characteristic or sort of defining theme of Locke's work. He's going to begin by trying to articulate very clearly exactly what kinds of abuses of power justify revolution, and in each stage he is going to respond to the objection, you are just inviting anarchy, that this is no theory of government at all. So let's turn now to the text, chapter 17, and look at the differences between usurpation and tyranny. So understanding that historical context and turning now to the text, these final chapters of the second treatise, we're looking for the criteria that Locke sets, the criteria of the behavior of the rulers that would justify citizens or subjects in withdrawing their consent to the social contract. And indeed, as we look through these final three chapters, we see a repetition of that cycle where Locke sets out conceptual criteria and then returns to the question, so this can't be anarchy because I have set such careful criteria. If the behavior of the ruler doesn't meet this threshold, then the people are not justified in revolution. And that's the primary import of chapter 17 of usurpation. It follows upon, of course, chapter 16, which I did not assign. Chapter 16 is called Of Conquest, and Locke is looking at the various ways that governments can be destroyed or come to their end. And he thinks the first and most obvious answer is, well, a foreign army can come in and invade your country and destroy the rulers and establish a new government. So we come from that now to chapter 17, where he's going to talk about domestic sources or causes of the ends of government. He starts chapter 17. As conquest may be called a foreign usurpation, so usurpation is a kind of domestic conquest, with this difference, that a usurper can never have right on his side, it being no usurpation, but where one has got into the possession of what another has right to. This, so far as it is usurpation, is a change only of persons, but not of the forms and rules of government. For if the usurper extend his power beyond what of right belonged to the lawful princes or governors of the commonwealth, it is tyranny added to usurpation. So we have these three categories. One is conquest, one is usurpation, and the third is tyranny. What primarily concerns us is the distinction between usurpation and tyranny. Locke says that usurpation is a change only of persons, but not of the forms and the rules of government. And it's that distinction only of persons, not forms and rules. If the forms and rules of government are violated, then that is tyranny. So the kind of archetypal image of the usurper is the king dies, the eldest son is first in line for the throne. Through some plotting or shenanigans, the uncle imprisons the eldest son and seizes the throne, or the younger son kills the older son and seizes the throne. So it is not the rightful heir to the throne who is actually sitting on the throne. That person is called a usurper. They have usurped the throne. But notice the distinction Locke wants us to make. If the wrong person gets on the throne, they are only a usurper as long as they obey the rules, the forms and rules of government. That is to say, you are not the rightful king, but you have not done anything as king that a king cannot normally lawfully do. Right? So there's a conceptual distinction between the natural individual and something more abstract. Locke, again, this takes us back to chapter 8 and his description of the kind of implicit math in his description of the social contract. What Locke is trying to tease out here, he doesn't quite have the word for, is constitutional or unconstitutional. Right? That the forms and rules of government describe kind of the rules of the game that we all agreed on when we started to play the game. Who occupies the office at any particular time or any particular role in those rules of the game is less important than the rules themselves. And again, Locke in 17th century England doesn't quite have the language that is so familiar to us because of our American political culture. Part of the reason that James Madison and the framers developed the conceptual categories they did is exactly because of this fuzziness. But Locke is essentially here trying to distinguish between the natural person or the office holder and the structure of the office itself. So for a usurper is still an illegitimate ruler, right? But look at the highlighted passage at the top of the left-hand column on 21. Whoever gets into the exercise of any part of the power by other ways than what the laws of the community have prescribed hath no right to be obeyed, though the form of the commonwealth be still preserved, since he is not the person the laws have appointed, and consequently not the person the people have consented to. So, you don't have to obey that particular person who's acting as king, but the office of the king, or the fundamental structure of government, the constitution of government, is nevertheless still preserved. So you are not justified in revolution. You are not justified in withdrawing your consent to the social contract because the forms and rules of government have not changed. Yes, that person is a jerk. Yes, that person has illegally seized the office. But as long as they're practicing or exercising the powers of that office consistent with the fundamental law, then you are still bound by your social contract, your social agreement. That is very different than tyranny, or what we Americans would say is unconstitutional behavior, right? Having violated the fundamental laws. So let's turn now to chapter 18 of tyranny. Locke begins chapter 18. As usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. And this is making use of the power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private separate advantage. When the governor, however entitled, makes not the law but his will the rule, and his commands and actions are not directed to the preservation of the properties of his people, but the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, or any other irregular passion. What should immediately jump out at us from this passage are the two principles articulated in chapter 9, the ends of political society. In chapter 9, Locke told us that there are two criteria for the legitimacy of any social contract. Number one, it must preserve the properties of its citizens. And number two, it must be bound by the common good of all. So when he comes to define tyranny, or the principles, the threshold that would justify you in withdrawing your agreement that you made to the social contract, we see these exact same principles, not the common good, but his own private, separate advantage. And his commands are directed not to the preservation of the properties of his people. Now, if tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, then right is defined by the law. And that's the significance of the quotes that follow from King James I. Now recall, John Locke in 1688 is leading Parliament in a revolution against King James II, the grandson of King James I. So Locke is here throwing sort of in the grandson's face these quotes from his granddad about how much he respects Parliament. But recall also from the Locke historical context discussion that King James I is a brand new king who has essentially been invited by Parliament to come take the throne, and particularly early in his reign, he has to be very diplomatic with Parliament as he establishes the legitimacy of his throne. So it's perfectly expected that King James I went to Parliament and made some very polite speeches about how much he respects Parliament's authority. Nevertheless, the sum here is the concept of the law, right? And so Locke summarizes at the top of the left-hand column of page 22, following these three quotes. Locke writes, "Thus that learned king, who well understood the notion of things, makes the difference betwixt a king and a tyrant to consist only in this, that one makes the laws the bounds of his power, and the good of the public the end of his government. The other makes all give way to his own will and appetite." And then skip a paragraph, and that first line of the final paragraph in the left-hand column is a really nice bumper sticker to encapsulate this concept. Locke writes, "Wherever law ends, tyranny begins." Now that sounds wonderful, and in particular it recalls to our mind that phrase, the forms and rules of government, right? The foundational principles, the rules of the game. But if we think critically about the historical context, we ask the question, well, who determines the law? And Locke's answer obviously would be Parliament determines the law. So another way of reading all these references to the law is, and of course following these passages from King James the First, who's giving speeches to Parliament, the inference is that Parliament determines the bounds of right for the king's authority. And that, of course, merely replicates the problem of who can be umpire, because then why does that not simply put Parliament in the place of where the king is now? Parliament claiming that we're the final authority and there's no appeal from our decisions. And so Locke's phrase in here, his rhetoric of the law, softens that contradiction or pastes over rhetorically that conceptual tension in those meanings of the law. And it's exactly that problem of who can be umpire, who shall judge, that raises the objection that a right of revolution is merely a license for anarchy. If we look on the right-hand column, that first full paragraph that's highlighted. May the commands then of a prince be opposed. May he be resisted as often as anyone shall find himself aggrieved, and but imagine he has not right done him. This will unhinge and overturn all polities, and instead of government and order, leave nothing but anarchy and confusion. How can one tell whether one is merely a disgruntled member of the minority, right? The majority has decided something and you think it's a bad policy. How can you decide whether your objection to the law is merely your disgruntled minority status, or if the law or the action of government violates something so fundamental that you are justified in withdrawing your agreement to the social contract. That's the problem. Who gets to decide? Because, of course, in the state of nature, our inner human nature is to always be self-interested, and anything that doesn't go our way, it is natural in us to turn that into a justification for not obeying the law. That's the potential for anarchy that's latent in Locke's theory of revolution. Here in chapter 18, he's going to give us a set of conditions or limitations on what resistance to the government can be. And he's going to give us a first, second, third, and fourth here. He says on the right, last partial paragraph on the right-hand column of 22, first, as in some countries, the person of the prince by the law is sacred, and so whatever he commands or does, his person is still free from all question or violence, not liable to force or any judicial censure or condemnation. This is clearly a reference to the English Civil War some 30 years, 40 years earlier than the Glorious Revolution, in which King Charles was captured on the battlefield, put on trial, found guilty, and then executed by the Parliament of the 1640s. Locke is here saying, we won't do that, right? The person of the prince, the body of the prince is sacred, even if we don't recognize his authority. This is essentially a renunciation of the actions of Parliament of a generation, 2 generations earlier. And similarly, here in the secondly on the left-hand column, let me get the page there, he writes, secondly, but this privilege belonging only to the king's person hinders not, but they may be questioned, opposed, and resisted who use unjust force, though they pretend a commission from him which the law authorizes not. Essentially what Locke is saying here is that we will resist with force those who are attempting to implement an unauthorized commission, an illegal warrant, say, or an illegal arrest. We will resist that only so long as those people, those agents of the king, are representing the king's legal authority. That is to say, I'm not going to pay the tax collector, and I'm going to shoot him if he comes to my door to take my property for what I believe is an unjust tax. But if I see that same guy, say at the bowling alley for bowling league on Tuesday night, I'm not going to go shoot him then because his day job is being a tax collector. My resistance is confined to that person's attempt to enforce on me an unjust government procedure. And again, the implication here is the right of resistance will not devolve into a civil war as it had a generation or so earlier. But now we get an escalation. He says, thirdly, supposing a government wherein the person of the chief magistrate is not thus sacred, yet this doctrine of the lawfulness of resisting unlawful exercises of his power will not upon every slight occasion endanger him or embroil the government, for where the injured party may be relieved and his damages repaired by appeal to the law, there can be no pretense for force, which is only to be used where a man is intercepted from appealing to the law. So, your case is justified here. That is, you have a rightful claim about the tyranny of the government. You are not justified in grabbing your gun and shooting the tax collector as long as you have a court that you can appeal to. Now, there's a kind of silliness about that, because if there are working courts, then the presumption is there's a kind of working government, right? The idea that tyranny is afoot would presume that the executive has corrupted the courts. But we come now to the culmination of these set of conditions. Fourthly, but if the unlawful acts done by the magistrate be maintained by the power he has got, and the remedy which is due by law be by the same power obstructed, right? The courts are actually closed to you. Yet the right of resistance, even in such manifest acts of tyranny, will not suddenly or on slight occasions disturb the government, For if it reach no farther than some private men's cases, though they have a right to defend themselves and to recover by force what by unlawful force is taken from them, yet the right to do so will not easily engage them in a contest wherein they are sure to perish. So the key here is it merely reaches to some private men's cases. The government has simply targeted individuals or small groups who are surely not capable of overthrowing the government. Locke's argument here is, well, they are certainly justified in resisting, right? But they're not going to win. And because they're not going to win, it's not very often that groups are going to take up arms against the government. So you see this escalation. In number 3, you are justified. That is, your complaint is valid, but you simply are not justified in revolution as long as you can appeal to a court. Here, you are fully justified in taking up arms. You're just going to lose because there's so few of you. So it's unlikely that you're going to make this decision. And so we come to this culmination now in the succeeding paragraph. But if either these illegal acts have extended to the majority of the people, or if the mischief and oppression has lighted only on some few, but in such cases as the precedent and consequences seem to threaten all, and they are persuaded in their consciences that their laws and with them their estates, liberties, and lives are in danger, and perhaps their religion too, how they will be hindered from resisting a legal force used against them, I cannot tell. And so there's a kind of swelling up here in which Locke poses barriers or limitations to the right of revolution, but as the depiction of the tyranny gets worse and worse, eventually that overwhelms the limitations and the people are going to do what they are going to do. But let's back up and notice these 3 criteria. There's a kind of wonky math here, or an indeterminate math, by which Locke is trying to set a standard. If we look in the right-hand column of 23, the penultimate paragraph, the 4th paragraph, he talks about private men's cases. And then in the succeeding paragraph, or the majority of people, or maybe on such few, but it seems to threaten all. So we have these 3 kind of numerical categories. We have few or individual, we have majority, and we have all. But Locke can't quite decide which threshold is sufficient to justify revolution. Now, each of these has justifications in his own theory. Right? We each individually got to decide whether or not the social contract was in our interest, whether we wanted to surrender our rights or not. It makes sense, therefore, that we should each individually get to decide whether the government is engaging in tyranny and we want to withdraw our consent. The problem, of course, is what we agreed to at the social contract was to give over our right to determine for ourselves. If we surrendered that right at the moment of the social contract, how can we claim that right now when the government is making decisions for us that we don't like, right? So there's a powerful impulse in Lockean theory to empower each individual person with the right of determining whether or not they consent to each individual law. However, to the extent that people do so, we are right back in the state of nature, not in civil society, with everybody making their own decisions and in the conflict that inevitably resolves. Now, when you surrendered your natural right, the thing you gave permission to make decisions to was the majority, right? So there's a certain logic that the majority can determine whether or not the government is behaving tyrannically and the people are justified in revolution. There's a certain logic to that. But of course, the majority requires or sort of presumes an operating governing institution in which the majority can be taken and act. And if you're in a tyrannical state, you can't presume that there's an existing operating political system, right? It presumes the thing that you're charging with corruption to depend on the rule of the majority. Certainly, if everyone agrees, the people in their entirety agree, that is a sufficient threshold to justify dissolving the social contract because, of course, it took a unanimous decision to bring the social contract into existence. That is the threshold of power that is above majority, all. But, of course, that is a almost impossible standard to reach, if for no other reason that the king himself probably does not think that he is behaving tyrannically. So it's virtually impossible to get all in a revolutionary situation. So hang on to these three numerical categories: the individual, the majority, and all. How each has a kind of rationalization in the basic principles Locke articulates for the state of nature. We're going to come back to this at the end of the following chapter. This is the fundamental dilemma that Locke ends on: individual, majority, or all. And we will see this come up again when we get to Rousseau's doctrine of revolution. So as we turn now to the final chapter of the reading, chapter 19, on the dissolution of government, we find Locke once again trying to create categories that will distinguish what are the acts of government that legitimize revolution and what are the acts of government that may be bad acts, they may be poor laws, but don't affect the fundamental forms and rules of government, and so are something less than tyranny. And we see here at the beginning of chapter 19, Locke begins with a distinction between society and government. He writes, "He that will with any clearness speak of the dissolution of government ought in the first place to distinguish between the dissolution of the society and the dissolution of the government. That which makes the community and brings men out of the loose state of nature into one politic society is the agreement which everyone has with the rest to incorporate and act as one body and so be one distinct commonwealth. The usual and almost only way whereby this union is dissolved is the inroad of foreign force making a conquest upon them." This distinction between society and government is particularly interesting because Locke has made it nowhere previously in the text. And in our next reading, Rousseau's On Social Contract, it's the place where Rousseau is going to begin to build his model of the social contract. Locke is suggesting here that the government can be removed, be dissolved, and yet a pre-existing agreement, an agreement to create society, will nevertheless persevere, that it is only in the case of foreign invasion that you would dissolve both government and society. In other cases of dissolving government, you can dissolve, that is domestic or internal causes of the dissolution of government. You can get rid of government without getting rid of society. Well, what is this society thing? He did not describe back in chapters 7, 8, and 9 when he was describing the origins of the social contract. He nowhere mentioned that there's going to be two different foundational agreements. One, we're going to create a society, and then we'll create a government, and presumably after the government's created, then majorities go into effect or whatnot. That was not part of his scheme. The inference here, not explicitly stated, is that society might be household or domestic relations. And if we consider the implications of that, we can start to appreciate Locke as a kind of nervous revolutionary, an anxious revolutionary in the context of 17th century Britain. He is here implying, but not explicitly stating, "Dear reader, don't be alarmed that I'm announcing that the people have a right of revolution. We are only going to overthrow the government. We're not going to overthrow household relationships." That is to say, just because the government has been dissolved, it does not mean that wives and children and servants and slaves are also returned to the state of nature. Now you can see in historical context why it would be important for Locke to make that concession or to give that kind of disclaimer to his audience, but it's precisely the mode that is going to be removed, or the element that's going to be removed as this doctrine becomes more radically revolutionary in the hands of Rousseau and then in the hands of the American revolutionaries. But fundamentally what Locke is implying here is, don't worry, we're going to overthrow the king. That doesn't mean that your slave is now equal to you. It doesn't mean that your servant is now equal to you, or your children, or your wife. Household relationships can persevere even as we engage in an act of political revolution. Having made that disclaimer, sort of calming the fears of his audience in 17th century Britain, Locke is now prepared to identify the specific acts of government that justify revolution. And the highlighted passage at the bottom of the right-hand column of 24, besides this overturning from without, meaning the inroad of foreign force making a conquest, besides this overturning from without, governments are also dissolved from within. First, when the legislative is altered. And he goes on to give a series of examples of this in the succeeding paragraphs. The numbering can get a little confusing in here, but these are all, on page 25, these are all examples of the legislative being altered. So the bottom of the left-hand column of 25. First, that when such a single person or prince sets up his own arbitrary will in the place of the laws, which are the will of the society declared by the legislative, then the legislative is changed. Secondly, when the prince hinders the legislative from assembling in its due time, or from acting freely pursuant to those ends for which it was constituted, the legislative is altered. Thirdly, when by the arbitrary power of the prince, the electors or ways of election are altered, without the consent and contrary to the common interest of the people, there also the legislative is altered. And fourthly, the delivery also of the people into the subjection of a foreign power, and so a dissolution, etc. There's a change, certainly a change of the legislative. So these are all specific examples of the broader categorical type ways in which government can be dissolved within of the type the legislative being altered. If we come to the page 26 on the right-hand column, we come to the second category. On the right-hand column, there is therefore secondly another way whereby governments are dissolved, and that is when the legislative or the prince, either of them, act contrary to their trust. And here he numbers first, but there is no second, third, or fourth. And so as you're going through this the first time, trying to follow these paragraph signals can be a little bit confusing. Whether of the first or the second type, they both amount to the same thing. If you look at the highlighted passage on the left-hand column at the bottom, in these and the like cases, when the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, differing from the other by the change of persons or form, or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good. So the ultimate consequence of either of these types is the right of the people to overthrow the government and create a new legislative power for themselves. When, again, Locke, in creating these two categories, that is, either the legislative is altered or the legislative or the prince acts contrary to their trust, again he's trying to tease out conceptually a set of categories for which he doesn't quite have the vocabulary. So if you think about those first set of examples when the legislative is altered, those are all pretty specific procedural things. We were supposed to have elections on the first Tuesday in November. The king intervened and put soldiers on the street so no one could vote. He has altered the modes of election, right? Very specific procedural forms in each one of those cases. Here we get to the question in the second category, acting contrary to their trust, an attempt to describe something more like has acted contrary to the common good. That more amorphous sort of has the interest of the people in his heart kind of category. So you see these two different types. One is essentially procedural. It's very technical. The rules say we're supposed to be able to do this, and we weren't allowed to do it, therefore it's a change of the forms and rules. The other is more trying to describe motivation or intent, right? The goodwill or absence of it of the rulers. But in both of these examples, right, or both of these categories, the end result is the same. We are dissolved from our agreement to abide by the legislative power, to obey the umpire. Before we turn then to the final movement of the text, let's just take a moment to summarize the elements of Locke's doctrine of revolution. If we step back then and take a summary view of Locke's doctrine of revolution, what is most striking about it is how much time and effort he puts into placing limitations and conditions upon our right of revolution. Right? Usurpation is bad. It is illegal if you wish, but it does not justify revolution. Only tyranny does. And tyranny is qualified by the conditions of the law. It's not my personal opinion. It's whether the law has been violated, this umpire that we created. And there are limits on our revolutionary authority. We can't harm the prince. We can only resist the officials when they're trying to carry out unlawful orders, etc. And then we must meet a kind of numerical threshold. Locke's not quite sure which one of these numerical thresholds is the correct one, but it has to reach a kind of critical mass of opposition to the government to be legitimate. And then we're not going to dissolve society, we're only going to dissolve government, and government will only dissolve under conditions that meet the criteria of these specific categories, that is, altering the legislative or breaking trust. So Locke would like you, if you are mad at the government and considering going and taking up your gun and resisting the government, to go through this checklist, take your complaint against the government, and measure it against each of these criteria. Only if you pass these threshold tests, then should you feel confident that your resistance is justified and lawful by the natural law of your consent and the surrender of your natural rights. So even with all of these conditions, all of this careful checklisting of the criteria that have to be met, Locke nevertheless ends the text returning back to this question, is this a license for anarchy? Is this, he says in the final passages, a ferment for frequent rebellion? So let's turn now and look at the final passages of the second treatise. So we find on page 27, after all of this effort that Locke has put into limiting and setting conditions on your right of revolution, that he needs to return to this objection in the final movement of the text. On the right-hand column in the highlighted passages, Locke writes, "But it will be said, this hypothesis lays a ferment for frequent rebellion, to which I answer." And he gives three answers in the succeeding paragraphs. First, no more than any other hypothesis, for when the people are made miserable and find themselves exposed to the ill usage of arbitrary power, cry up their governors as much as you will for sons of Jupiter. Let them be sacred and divine, descended or authorized from heaven. Give them out for whom or what you please, the same will happen. The people, generally ill-treated and contrary to right, will be ready upon any occasion to ease themselves of a burden that sits heavy upon them. So the people are nervous and anxious, and when you mistreat them, it doesn't matter how high your authority is, the people will respond. Notice how different that is than the second explanation for why this is not a ferment for frequent rebellion. Secondly, Locke writes at the top of the left-hand column, secondly, I answer, such revolutions will not happen upon every little mismanagement in public affairs. Great mistakes in the ruling part, many wrong and inconvenient laws, and all the slips of human frailty will be borne by the people without mutiny or murmur. So notice how different this explanation is than the first one. In the first one, the people are sort of on their toes, ready for tyranny, and when they see it, it doesn't matter how powerful you are, they will revolt against you. Here, the people are sheep. They're used to being abused. Normal, wrong and inconvenient laws will be borne without mutiny or murmur. It's exactly the opposite portrait of human nature, and this dichotomy between these two explanations corresponds to the portraits of human nature in the state of nature and the state of war. Right? In the state of nature, we're reasonable and cooperative, so we will put up with wrong and inconvenient laws without a murmur because we understand that our long-term interest is served by protections from predators in the state of war. The reason that we devolve into the state of war is because we are ready at every moment to jump on someone transgressing our rights. And so Locke original dichotomy, sort of dualism of his portrait of human nature, that he never resolves the conflict between chapters 2 and chapters 3. What does he really think about man's nature? Again emerges here at the end of the text when he can't come up with a satisfactory answer for why this won't be a ferment for frequent rebellion, which brings him to his third defense. He says, thirdly, I answer that this doctrine of a power in the people of providing for their safety anew by a new legislative when their legislators have acted contrary to their trust by invading their property is the best fence against rebellion and the probablest means to hinder it. And this, of course, brings us right back to the premise of human nature in his first defense. That is to say, if the rulers are nervous that the people are about to revolt, they will be on their guard and only pass laws that are in the common good and not serve their self-interest. Well, that presumes that more aggressive and antagonistic or conflict-oriented dimension or aspect of Locke's portrait of human nature. So he's essentially spinning back and forth, and can't resolve this conflict about why we can be trusted with a right of judging whether the government has abused us. And that is the final dilemma of the entire text. If we come to the final page, page 29, and we look on the left-hand column, here is the great concluding question of Locke's second treatise. Here it is like the common question will be made, who shall be judge, whether the prince or the legislative act contrary to their trust? And so we return here to the question that we asked in chapters 7, 8, and 9. Who can be umpire, right? Locke said that the absolute monarch cannot be umpire because he wanted us to rely on that confusion between the monarch as a natural man and the monarch as an institution or office. Here, because he's talking about dissolving government, there's no ambiguity. This is about two guys fighting over apples, who owns the apples in the trees in the state of nature. Here we're down to the question of, has the government violated its fundamental rules and forms? And so now we need to know, who can be umpire? Who shall be judge? Right? And Locke is again, in the conclusion of the text, going to give contradictory answers. He says, this perhaps ill-affected and factious men may spread amongst the people when the prince makes only use of his due prerogative. To this I reply, the people shall be judge. For who shall be judge whether his trust or deputy acts well, and according to the trust reposed in him, but he who deputes him, and must, by having deputed him, have still a power to discard him. So the people is the collective, the community, the group as a whole, right? Well, what number of people? Is it a majority? Does it require all? Right? Next paragraph. But farther this question, who shall be judge, cannot mean that there's no judge at all. For where there's no judicature on earth to decide controversies amongst men, God in heaven is judge. He alone, it is true, is judge of the right. But every man is judge for himself, as in all other cases, so in this, whether another hath put himself into a state of war with him. And this takes us right back to chapter 3, right? In the state of nature, we each get to decide for ourselves. When it came time for the social contract, we each got to determine for ourselves whether it was in our personal best interest to give up our natural rights, surrender them over to the community, and gain the protections of society. Because we each got to decide for ourselves, there's a kind of compulsory logic that says, well, then I get to decide for myself whether the government, whether the king is acting as a tyrant towards me. But that enters me into the paradox. When I entered the social contract, what I did was give over my right to judge. I surrendered it to the community. So it seems like it can't be the individual. And indeed, in the very next paragraph, Locke seems to acknowledge that. Top of the right-hand column. If a controversy arise betwixt a prince and some of the people in a matter where the law is silent or doubtful, and the thing be of great consequence, I should think the proper umpire in such a case should be in the body of the people. Right? For in cases where the prince hath a trust reposed in him and is dispensed from the common ordinary rules of law, blah, 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 down to the final line. The injured party must judge for himself when he will think fit to make use of that appeal and put himself upon it. To conclude, the power that every individual gave the society when he entered into it can never revert to the individual again as long as the society lasts, but will always remain in the community. So notice how many times Locke contradicts himself in these final 3 or 4 paragraphs. The people shall be judged. Every man is judged for himself. The proper umpire has to be the body of the people. The injured party must judge for himself. But the power that the individual gave society can never come back to the individual, and it has to remain in the community. As we reach the climax of the text, the concluding paragraph, this contradiction that's at the heart of Locke's theory of the social contract intensifies and exacerbates itself, and he can never resolve it because it's embedded in his portrait of man's nature from the early chapters of the text. These contradictions, these conceptual tensions, these sort of unresolved paradoxes in Locke's text are going to be the central object of subsequent writers, right? So when we come to Rousseau and the American writers, they are very familiar with Locke's theory. They're very familiar with these conceptual problems, and they're going to articulate different forms of the social contract that try to resolve these conceptual tensions, but in the process are going to create their own, and exploring that relationship as subsequent writers try to address Locke's primary model, but solve different problems that we pointed out in it. It propels the evolution or the conceptual genealogy of these ideas as they propel themselves towards the federal constitution. All right, so we have concluded Locke, and we're going to turn now in the next module to looking at Rousseau.